This book has sold over 1 million copies in the past 30 years or so. It has a strong, very strong following of fans, yet it has also frustrated many people's attempts at reading it. From reviewer Stephen Moore, this novel is so brilliant you need sunglasses to read it, but it has a heart as well as a brain. This novel is both a tragicomic epic and a profound study of the postmodern condition. From Tom Bissell in the New York Times on the 20th anniversary of the novel, it is an endlessly, compulsively entertaining book that stingily withholds from readers the core pleasures of mainstream novelistic entertainment, among them a graspable central narrative line, identifiable movement through time, and any resolution of its quadrumvirate plot lines. This novel, in other words, can be exceedingly frustrating. Others, like Dale Peck, describe the novel as terrible, as bloated, boring, gratuitous, and perhaps especially uncontrolled. And then Harold Bloom, of course, that well-known critic, once described this novel as just awful. Bloom goes on to state that the author has no discernible talent. Okay, old Harold, let's take a step back a little bit. Sorry for the extended preamble today, but we are talking about a big book, and we are, of course, talking about Infinite Jest. Wallace's 1996 novel, Infinite Jest. Where to begin? The famous, infamous behemoth of postmodern or post-postmodern, neo-realist, encyclopedic narrative, whatever you want to classify this book as, this 1,000 plus page novel. It can be both an immense challenge to read, but it can also lead to some of the most deeply pleasurable and rewarding experiences a piece of literature can give. At least that was my experience with it, and I'm sure others would have similar experiences as well. So what brought me personally to Infinite Jest? Why read this novel? Well, for me, so given my own interests in literature, which spans from ancient classical Greek literature to contemporary literature, anything good that gets one pondering the good old questions of what it is to be human. This type of literature includes the classics, yes, like Homer, Shakespeare, T.S. Eliot, Marcel Proust, but also the more slightly obscure, such as the fabliaux of 13th century France, or, for example, Lucien of Samosata, writing science fiction utopian stories roughly 2,000 years ago, Marquis de Sade, Robert Musil, etc. And then there's the philosophy as well. For me, my interest in philosophy, anywhere from Plato to Nietzsche to Gilles Deleuze and back. This is my wide-scoped area of interest, and this is the material that one would find amongst my bookshelves. Wallace's novel is revered as a challenging piece of literature. Perhaps I've always been drawn a little to such revered literary challenges. The novel is encyclopedic in its scope, but also in many ways narrow in its focus. It's also a book that touches on the history of literature, as it does with somewhat of a philosophical background. Wallace himself, before devoting himself to literature, did study philosophy at, I believe it was at Harvard. This novel is also revered as a dark novel, as seen in many of its themes, which I will get into very shortly. And yes, I also have a bit of a penchant for such dark pieces of literature, these darker themes. So all of these things drew me to Wallace, to this novel, and I'm sure glad they did. Now, let's get into the novel a little bit here. So one of the key themes in the novel is around the experience of loneliness, of isolation or alienation, depression. All of the characters in the novel, one way or another, are dealing with these kind of problems, albeit in their own different ways throughout the novel. So how does loneliness manifest itself for these characters? Early on in the novel, this loneliness is described by Hal and Cadenza and some of the other characters at the tennis academy. So these are young tennis players at an elite tennis academy, and they're describing this idea of loneliness as they're experiencing it as, quote, existential individuality, as solipsism. And this idea of solipsism, of course, coming from philosophy, the idea that the individual self can be the only thing really known for sure. The only epistemic certainty that we can have, or that I can have, is about the self, myself, not about others or the external world around me. So this can be, of course, a very alienating idea. And Wallace really takes it up in this novel. So these tennis players describe this pressure of being a high-level elite athlete. They're all together at this academy, they're all in this community, but they're also tragically and ironically alone. They are united in their suffering and loneliness. Hal himself even sneaks away from the others at the academy to get secretly high on marijuana. This is described early on, around page 52. So Hal himself is struggling with this isolation and loneliness. Characters struggle and have this continual need to connect with others, and they struggle in connecting with others. And instead of successfully connecting with others, they end up digging deeper into themselves, into this solipsism. Another way connected with the theme of loneliness is around the nature of entertainment and how entertainment affects us, or the lengths that we will go to obtain entertainment. Throughout the book, there are characters that are desperately trying to get a hold of a copy of this elusive film titled Infinite Jest. A film that is said to be so entertaining that people wouldn't know what else to do with their lives but watch the film over and over again. What can be better than that? So the novel, written in 1996, takes place in the near future, and the entertainment industry is aggressively more consumer-driven, where the viewer can become her, and this is a quote from the novel, can become her or his own programming director. Something more like perhaps the Netflix era that we have today. Instant, choosable entertainment, or the social media of today, perhaps, where we don't have to deal with things like television reruns, commercials. Then, of course, there's the drugs, the addiction, the withdrawal from life and human connection that comes with serious addiction problems. We already mentioned Hal, who retreats to solitude in order to get secretly high. There are also other characters in the novel, other plot lines in the novel where characters are struggling in a halfway house, the O.N.A.N house. And there are often flashbacks to these characters' times as addicts, or there are harrowing descriptions of their relapses. There's also more extreme talk about loneliness, depression, and suicide even. Of course, all of these topics that I've mentioned already are things that Wallace himself experienced. So he was in his youth a regionally ranked tennis player in the US. He was a self-proclaimed television fanatic when he was younger, at least. He dealt with addictions and spent time in treatment centers in Boston. And he also lived with depression himself, having sadly committed suicide in 2008. So let's talk a little bit about the writing now. The writing itself is perhaps tricky to describe. It is multifaceted. So Wallace wonderfully dips into this wide variety of different vernaculars, from Quebecois, French Canadian accents, and even language. The vernacular of a drug addict, and the vernacular and speech of these high elite tennis players. And then there's also the vocabulary and the theory that comes from film studies as it follows the filmmaker character Jim N. Cadenza. And of course, a lot of the vocabulary in the novel is made up. There are a lot of countless neologisms throughout, many of which involve humor or references and allusions to whatever obscure topic the novel is delving into at that point. Some of this writing and some of the perspectives in the novel are definitely easier to read than others. Some of it's more entertaining and more pleasurable to read, whereas some of it is a little more tedious and kind of drags on a little bit. There are, of course, references to Hamlet. The title itself is taken from Hamlet, from the famous quote in Act 5, Scene 1, where Hamlet is holding the skull of Yorick. And I'll quote from that scene. So he says, "Alas, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest." And it goes on and on. So infinite jest taken directly from that. The character Jim N. Cadenza, his film production company is also called Poor Yorick Entertainment. Hal is seen reading Hamlet in the novel, at least at one point on page 171. And then the characters themselves can also be seen as portraying different characters from Hamlet. So Hal can be seen as portraying Hamlet himself, Prince Hamlet. His father, Jim, can be seen as playing the role of Hamlet's father, the dead King of Denmark. Jim is dead in the novel after having committed suicide by tampering with a microwave in order to be able to fit his head inside while it is still running. Yes, that is some of the dark ridiculousness that comes out in the novel. And then also, as in Hamlet, as the ghost of Hamlet's father appears in the play, the ghost of Jim N. Cadenza appears in Infinite Jest as well. It appears to one of the characters at the end of the novel, whose name is Gately. And then there's also at least one direct reference in the novel to Robert Burton and his wonderful book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, which I have right here. So The Anatomy of Melancholy. This is a 17th century book where Burton lays out and describes, and he completely anatomizes the nature of melancholy, or what we would today call depression. This is a massive book, as you can see. For one, it is encyclopedic in its scope. It's a massive work of literature. In some ways, it is like a scholastic medical text from the period of the 1600s, but really it's so much more than that. And while the nature of melancholy is certainly its starting point, it delves into so much more, into other topics connected with human life and with the human condition. Wallace's novel, likewise, is encyclopedic. It is often termed, along with the likes of Joyce's Ulysses or Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, as works of encyclopedic narrative. Wallace's novel pushes the boundaries of the genre of the novel as well, much like Robert Burton pushes the boundaries of the medical text, of the scholastic medical text. Both works deal specifically with, and in many ways and in different ways, with anatomizing melancholy, the nature of loneliness and depression. Then there are also the literary influences that are noted for Wallace and for the writing of this novel. The likes of Thomas Pynchon, William Gaddis, two key influences of David Foster Wallace's. These are two authors that I have not yet had the acquaintance of reading, but I very much look forward to getting to those. And then there's other potential influences from Franz Kafka, James Joyce, Fyodor Dostoevsky. So I believe it is Dostoevsky's brothers Karamazov is mentioned somewhere in the novel as well. And one last piece of influence that I might note here being the great American 20th century writer William S. Burroughs. Burroughs' harrowing depictions of the lives of addicts in his works like Junkie and Naked Lunch. They are haunting, and they, as I was reading Infinite Jest, they really were in the back of my mind as distant memories, because it's been such a long time since I've read Burroughs. There's a reviewer, Stephen Moore, who describes Infinite Jest as a naked lunch for the 90s. And he goes on to say that Burroughs was largely a response to the need to conform in the Eisenhower 50s, while in Wallace, addiction is a response to the stress, to the need to excel in the Reagan 80s. So interesting connections there between those two authors and these two works. And for any of you Burroughs fans out there, if you haven't come across it, check out the wonderful Cronenberg film, Naked Lunch. This is from the 90s as well. Strange, wonderful, crazy movie. Definitely check that out. So now I just want to get into a few quotes from the novel, just to give you a little bit of a taste. There's a lot that I could look at in here. Here we have on page 773, we have two characters, Hal and Mario. They are brothers, the Incandenza brothers, having a late night discussion on, it's just a discussion on different ways that people can lie. It's just interesting. It's a little bit humorous how they're describing the nature of lying. So I'll get right into it here. You know, for me, Boo, people seem to lie in different but definite ways, I've found. Maybe I can't change the spin the way you can, and this is all I've been able to do, is assemble a kind of field guide to the different kinds of ways. Some people, from what I've seen, Boo, when they lie, they become very still and centered, and their gaze very concentrated and intense. They try to dominate the person they lie to, the person to whom they're lying. Another type becomes fluttery and insubstantial and punctuates his lie with little self-deprecating motions and sounds, as if credulity were the same as pity. Some bury the lie in so many digressions and asides that they like to try to slip the lie in there through all the extraneous data, like a tiny bug through a window screen. It goes on a little bit. And then there are what I might call your kamikaze-style liars. These will tell you a surreal and fundamentally incredible lie, and then pretend a crisis of conscience and retract the original lie, and then offer you the lie they really want you to buy instead. So the real lie will appear as some kind of concession, a statement with truth. That type's mercifully easy to see through, the merciful type of lie. Or then the type who sort of over-elaborates on the lie, buttresses it with rococo formations of detail and amendment, and that's how you can always tell. So we have this wonderful, in-depth, humorous discussion about different ways people lie, using ridiculous labels such as kamikaze-style liars or rococo formations of detail. Now, there's often throughout Wallace's writing this lovely combination of the ridiculous or the humorous with the obscene and grotesque, and also at the same time the rather beautiful. There might not be, in this example I just read, the obscene or the grotesque, but the next quote you will see that for sure. There is the ridiculous and the humorous in there, and I would say the beautiful, those rococo formations of detail. There's something, just aesthetically pleasing about that image, about that idea, about that statement. It's a pretty phrase mixed with ridiculous comparisons, all merely to describe the nuanced ways that people can lie. It's wonderful, it's entertaining, and there's something understandably universal as well in these descriptions. It's not all overly ridiculous, even if it may seem like it on the surface. There's something familiar in the ridiculous, which is perhaps what makes it that much more ridiculous, also that much more universal. Human nature itself is filled with the ridiculous. Wallace knows that, and he picks that out all over the place. In describing his idea of the purpose for fiction, Wallace once stated in an interview somewhere that fiction is about what it is to be a fucking human being. That's it. Moments like these throughout Infinite Jest do just that. This is fiction for Wallace. And yeah, it's entertaining in many ways, but it's still entertaining at the same time. There's something about the way that Wallace does that just really sucks me into a lot of these sections in the novel. So now the next quote I want to read is between pages 302 and 303. This is following an addict by the name of Tony Krause, poor Tony Krause, and he's dealing with withdrawals in this scene while he's trying to get clean while spending his time in a library bathroom. And this scene just really disturbingly kind of describes the experience that an addict feels while going through withdrawal. Okay, so time began to take on new aspects for him now as withdrawal progressed. Time began to pass with sharp edges. Its passage in the dark or dim-lit stall was like time was being carried by a procession of ants, a gleaming red Marshall column of those militaristic red southern U.S. ants that build hideous tall boiling hills, and each vile gleaming ant wanted a minuscule little portion of poor Tony's flesh in compensation, as it helped bear time slowly forward down the corridor of true withdrawal. What a description of time there. By the second week in the stall, time itself seemed the corridor, lightless at either end. By the second week in the stall, time itself seemed the corridor, lightless at either end. After more time, time then ceased to move or be moved throughable and assumed a shape above and apart, a huge, musty-feathered, orange-eyed wingless fowl hunched incontinent atop the stall, with a kind of watchful but deeply uncaring personality that didn't seem keen on poor Tony Krause as a person at all, or to wish him well. And it goes on and on here. Time came to him in the falcon black of the library night, in an orange mohawk and merry widow with tacky Amalfi pumps and nothing else. Time spread him and entered him roughly and had its way and left him again in the form of endless gushing liquid shit that he could not flush enough to keep up with. He spent the longest morbid time trying to fathom whence all the shit came from when he was ingesting nothing at all but Codenex Plus. Then at some point he realized time had become the shit itself. Poor Tony had become an hourglass. Time moved through him now. He ceased to exist apart from its jagged, edged flow. And it just goes on and on. So we get this wonderful, dark example where all three of those, the ridiculous or obscene and grotesque and the beautiful, they're all coming together here brilliantly in this gripping prose, this display of the experiences that an addict feels while going through withdrawal. One of the major plot lines in the novel is centered around the halfway house, the O.N.A.N house, and many of the characters deal with these kind of examples, with these kinds of things. They're dealing with different addictions. And this is a key aspect of the novel connected with the theme of loneliness, isolation, alienation. And Wallace's own experiences with these kinds of things really allows him to go into these inner psyches of these characters, really giving first-hand experiences of these kinds of feelings. So yeah, it's sections like that that would just really suck you into the novel and just keep you kind of engaged into it for pages and pages and pages. Of course, there are other sections that do not grab a hold of the reader so much, sections that are perhaps slower, more of a slog to get through. And then there's the endnotes, the endless endnotes, the infinite endnotes. There are 388 of them in total, some of them multiple pages long. Some of them have their own endnotes even. And this is all to do, as Wallace describes in a later interview, in order to disrupt the reader from the narrative, the linear narrative flow of the novel. This is, after all, postmodern literature or post-postmodern literature. This is anti-linearity in terms of narrative. This is something that emerges with modern literature in many ways, but really goes to the extreme here with David Foster Wallace. So the narrative structure and the linearity is all jumbled. The plot lines bounce back and forth from the Enid House plot to the tennis academy or to the strange Quebec-Canadian anti-O.N.A.N terrorist cell. And then it also bounces between timelines throughout all of these plots. So with flashbacks occurring, the narration going between third person or some kind of third person omniscient, with some instances of first person narration taking place from the perspective of Helen Condenza. I believe that's the only time we see first person narration is from Hal's point of view. The rest of the time it's usually third person. So yeah, everything's all jumbled, and it's a jumbled mess. It's a ridiculous and hectic mess, but it's also just a portrayal for Wallace of just fucking human life. There's something unreal or surreal, but also very real and universal about it all. Yeah. I started reading this book around, it was December of 2022. I got through the first half, and then my life just got way too busy with school and other commitments. So I reluctantly had to put my reading of this on hiatus, and I didn't get back to finishing it until this past December of 2023. So 1 full year. And I recall when I started the novel being really excited about it, and yeah, it was great starting out with it, but then it did just kind of drag on and on. The endnotes dragged me on, and it was just becoming a big slog and a mess of a book to keep track of. And then I went through my break where I went many months without reading it at all. And then when I came back to it, when I finally came back to finish it, I felt refreshed. I felt really excited to be back into this strange and jumbled world. I was gripped tightly by the book again, and the last couple hundred pages especially, I found just really had me engaged into what was happening, especially with what was happening to the character Gately, and how his end was unraveling throughout those last few hundred pages. As the book builds towards this end, I could just feel this expected finish, this kind of fatalistic outcome for the character Gately. As he lay in the trauma wing at the hospital, desperately trying not to relapse, trying to keep the doctors from administering pain meds to him. I could just see what was tragically coming for him. And the novel ends with a bit of, well, on the one hand, there's the horrendous scene or flashback to a scene of Gately's. And then after that, there's this beautiful image of the sunset as it kind of, the novel peters out with this sunset. And the ending is somewhat open to interpretation, or at least it has been interpreted in slightly different ways. But I won't get into specifics about that here. The openness perhaps adds to the overall jumbled nature of the work. But I feel like it worked wonderfully, how it built towards the ending. As soon as I finished it, even though the entire journey was such a slog, honestly, I felt like I wanted to go back to the beginning and read it all over again right away. Perhaps I'll save that for another day in the near future, but yeah, like it's challenging to get through at times, but then you reach parts and it's like there's the reward. And then yeah, at the end with that reward, it just made me want to relive the whole experience again. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Would I recommend Infinite Jest? Would I recommend this novel? It certainly isn't for everyone. If these themes interest you, still, it might not be for you. It is a slog, it is a challenge, and it does take time and devotion. But I feel for me, at least, it was worth it. I really did enjoy it. Now, will it be worth it for you? Well, you'll just have to try it out for yourself. Don't be too discouraged. If it doesn't work out, oh well. Just remember, it's all just human fucking life. Try it out, fail, whatever, move on to something else. If you do try it out and you love it, fantastic. Yeah. So I'll end there, and as always, keep reading.